This is a question that really is mind-boggling, maybe the most important question out there, and it's the kind of thing that doesn't make much sense. But as you get more and more into the deep structure of the universe, none of it ever makes any sense. So here we go. Kevin Jordan wants to know, as our observation and comprehension of what we are observing in the universe increase exponentially, is the universe reacting to our perception by becoming more complex? If the universe is ever expanding, is that rate tied directly to our ability to understand it, or is that vanity? It certainly seems like vanity, doesn't it? I mean, it seems like the highest form of vanity, and it seems like the entire scientific revolution was predicated on the idea of removing humanity from the center of the universe. That, you know, the Earth was literally the center of the universe upon which the entire universe rotated. And yet, what we find experimentally, and even on a fairly macro scale, is we find, well, certainly everybody knows that when you make an observation, you affect the outcome. That the act of observing changes the outcome, or at least on some level changes the outcome. The essence of the Heisenberg uncertainty principle would be that you can know the location of a particle or the speed of a particle, but you can't know both, because by measuring one, you lock out the other. It's not a question of whether or not you have sufficiently sophisticated apparatus. It is in fact built into the structure of the universe, and this is where Schrodinger's cat comes from. The idea that if you put a cat, and it's a kind of a gruesome thought experiment, especially if you're a cat lover as I am, but the idea being, if you put a cat into a closed box, and into that box you put a poison vial and a fuse, let's say acid eating away at a piece of metal, and that the fuse had a precisely 50% chance of killing the cat, burning through and killing the cat, or not burning through and allowing the cat to live, precisely 50%. Then according to probability theory, with the cat in the box, the cat was living in a state of both existence and non-existence, that in a quantum belief anyway, that the cat existed in both states, and that only by opening the box and observing whether or not the cat was alive or dead did you compress these probability waves down to the bottom quantum level and get the answer. The universe responds to the observation, and yet it makes so little empirical rational sense that I suspect it's probably true. We've talked about this before, talked about it last episode. One of the great breakthroughs, and I'm just speaking for myself here, one of the great breakthroughs for me in understanding the universe and in understanding, you know, astrophysics and understanding astronomy, deep history, 10 dimensions, you know, string theory, all this stuff. One of the great breakthroughs for me, and I wish more scientists would come to this point, especially people like Neil deGrasse Tyson, who we'll come to later. One of the great breakthroughs for me I came to with that little afterburner I did about Howie, about that little bird, because I was thinking about this little bird that I'd rescued from my cowling in my airplane, and I realized that this bird will never shoot at an instrument approach, no matter how long I try to approach it or teach it. My cat will never do calculus. I can't do calculus. I'm not entirely sure. I'm not entirely sure that I can be trained to do calculus, but I suspect that if I was put in a room and beaten severely, I could probably perform calculus. But my cat will never perform calculus, and Coco the gorilla will never perform calculus, because we just don't have the neurons. We just simply do not have the neurons. There are calculations that are beyond our ability. If you have a 2 megapixel picture, you will not get as sharp an image as you will if you get a 30 megapixel picture, and it doesn't matter how good the lens is. It's just not there. It's just not there. And so when we come to things like this idea of Schrodinger's cat and the uncertainty principle, and the idea that we can measure the state of a particle and the particle's antiparticle, which could be at the other end of the universe, by us measuring it here, that other particle instantly commits to being the opposite charge instantaneously, then when you get into these kind of things, there is so much about it that seems incomprehensible that I suspect it's actually true, because the great breakthrough for me is that we are facing things that are beyond our ability to comprehend. if you think that this is a condemnation of humanity or human intellect, it's just exactly the opposite. What we're able to accomplish using models and maps and simulations and theory is astonishing. It's astonishing what we can do. But when people say, oh, how well do you know Texas? Well, I know Texas. I've got a map of Texas. I've driven through Texas. You don't know anything about Texas. Even if you live in Texas your entire life, all you may know about Texas are the general large-scale features of that little limited part of Texas that you've seen. I don't care if you've got a map of Texas and have all the towns memorized. You've got a piece of paper with little blots of ink on it. That's not Texas. That's a map of Texas. The map is not the territory. Texas is infinitely more complex. Anything in the world is infinitely more complex. So, this could in fact be the case. To get back to the question, what the question is basically saying is this. If it turns out that by observing nature, we change nature, that nature responds to our observation, then you could basically, and I'm kind of paraphrasing here, but in a nutshell, it basically comes down to this. When you have humanoid observers, like Australopithecus, let's say, he looks up into the sky, or she looks up into the sky, and they see little sparks of light, then the universe did, in fact, consist of nothing more than sparks of light. It wasn't like it was galaxies and stars and this theory says no. It was just that. And as you developed a telescope and you first looked through a telescope, the universe had to become more complex to match the scale and the complexity of your observation. It's not to say that the universe existed in the same state as Schrodinger's cat. It existed in a state of malleability is maybe the best word. And as you observed it, the universe had to collapse itself down to the probability levels of the individual atoms and so on, the particles, and it just had to respond. As we get more and more complex with our observations, the universe appears to become more and more complex in return. Now, the logical, rational, reasonable thing to say is, look, no, it's much simpler than that. The universe is built extremely complex, and we just get more sophisticated at looking at it. That makes sense. Makes a lot of sense. That's why it's so hard to get to where this question is coming from. But the mathematical, the deep physical, the quantum evidence, the 11-dimensional theory of things are all indicating that maybe this is not the case. Now you start to get into really interesting things. This is what I think is the best case you can make for the existence of God, frankly. If you want to convince a professional skeptic, a scientist. That's where I used to be. I had it all figured out. I had the universe all figured out. How could I not have it figured out? I mean, I'm a smart guy. Well, it may be more than my little monkey brain can handle. And if it turns out that certain things that we do know are true, there are things we know are true. We know that when we make observations on a quantum level, we change nature. We change it. We know that if we observe nature in a certain way, light behaves as particles. If we observe it in a different way, light behaves as waves. We know that by observing one, it locks out the other. If it turns out that we look at things and change the way they are by our observation, and that is true, whether you like it or not, it's true, then you have to ask yourself, if this is what this cantaloupe-sized hunk of gray jelly can do, what can you do with a bigger consciousness? If you have a larger consciousness, that larger consciousness would be able to make more discrete observations, have more of a discrete effect on the universe as those observations were made. And frankly, if you had a consciousness big enough, you'd be able to just think about something, it comes into being. One of the things that was the most interesting things I ever heard, was by this guy who, I forget his name, but he's the guy who's done this video I spoke so highly of and I still think is the most important single thing I've ever seen, called Imagining the 10th Dimension. It's on YouTube. Imagining a 10th dimension is a look at why there are 10 dimensions. He looks at 0 dimensions, 1 dimension, 2 dimension, 3 dimensions. We're good through, 2 to 3 dimensions. First dimension, got it. Second dimension, yeah, easy. Flatland. Third dimension, that's us. Fourth dimension, yeah, I can see how we're moving through the fourth dimension. Fifth dimension, sixth dimension, seventh dimension, eighth dimension, ninth, all the way up to 10. So there are 11 dimensions, the 0 being the bottom dimension. But what this guy said, almost in passing, because he's done 100 videos, he said that the ultimate structure of the universe is not matter, and the ultimate structure of the universe isn't gravity. It's not the interplay of energy. He said that the actual structure, the architecture of the universe is information. Now that is a profound Profound, profound insight. Maybe he's wrong. Who knows? Maybe it is just as simple as it looks. But his argument that really rang me was the idea that it might, in fact, be a universe built out of information. That the information, the ability to discriminate between one state and another, is what compresses the probabilities of quantum existence into actual existence. In other words, the observation forces the external world to make a decision. That's really what it comes down to. When you observe something, when you're doing it just on a very simple level with electrons, with Heisenberg, when you make the observation, you are forcing that particle to make a decision. You are telling it, we're looking for a wave, therefore we can't, or we're looking for your position, therefore we can't know your speed. We're looking for your speed, therefore we can't know your position. Your observation changes the state of matter, state of nature changes in response to the question being asked, and you have imported information into a system and forced the universe to make a decision. Now, that is bloody interesting, isn't it? I mean, that's just really interesting. And look, this would all be just, this would be no different than any other nutty theory, except that the math is behind it. There's math. There's actual math. It has predictive value. The cell phones don't work without this theory, and photoreceptors don't work without this theory. Nothing works without this stuff working. And so, if you start to understand, let's just assume it's true, because it's the way you learn things, right? You make an assumption the world is true, and let's just see. Best way to disprove a bad theory is to assume it's true. Best way to disprove the Loch Ness Monster theory is to assume that it really is a plesiosaur living in Loch Ness. Once you start from the belief that it's an actual plesiosaur living in Loch Ness, the theory falls apart immediately. Just assume that we never meant to the moon. The whole thing was a fake. When you think about the problems you have to build in order to overcome the reality and make the fraud, then the moon landing fraud theory falls apart. So give it to it and take it as it exists. It is remarkable, it's astonishing, it's weird, but it appears to be true. So where does that leave you? Kind of comes back to the question we were discussing earlier about, is there other life in the universe? Hard to say. Maybe there are pockets of, if I had to guess, right? If I had to guess, I would say that and this is going to sound very bizarre, but try to imagine the universe as basically as a sea of pudding, okay? It's just a giant sea of possibility. And I'm not a physicist. If I had to guess based on all the little sips out of the well that I've taken, this is what I would say the universe is. If you could get far enough back on it and look down onto it, the universe would be a sea of pudding, basically be a sea of undifferentiated probabilities. When I say pudding, I don't mean matter. I mean it's in a state of perpetual probabilities. And I don't think we're the only intelligent life in the universe. I think the odds are just too strong against that, but I think it's rare. And so I would say that if you could look down upon it, maybe what you would see is you'd see this giant sea of pudding. And then, in small areas throughout this goop of uncertainty, there would be small little pockets of complexity. And these pockets of complexity would not be driven by the state of gravity or anything else. They'd be driven by the fact that there is an observer, that there is some observer there, and that as the observer, meaning the species or whoever, not an individual, series of individuals, as that observer becomes more sophisticated, the area within their observation becomes more sophisticated, and it expands out the complexity of that observation bubble. Now, that may not seem to make any sense, but if you think of the universe as being built out of information, it makes a lot of sense, because what you're really talking about is the structure of the universe becoming more complex in the areas surrounding observers who are capable of asking intelligent questions. And the more intelligent their questions and their queries become, the more complex that area of the universe within their observation horizon has to be. I think I've solved everything now. I'll probably just go home. If that's what I can do with 5% endocrine function, then I would say keep me out of the state of endocrine health, because I'll simply be able to bore through graphite and, with my mind. Granite. Meant to say granite. See? This is what happens when you're confused. Anyway, that's what I think. It's a great question, and I don't know. I have it's so far out of whack that it's got a ring of truth to it that I can't put my finger on.